Nobody announces that they're manipulating you. It doesn't arrive as aggression. It doesn't look like a threat. It looks like a conversation, a favor, a moment of someone being unusually understanding. And by the time you feel the weight of what just happened, you've already agreed to something you didn't choose, moved in a direction you didn't pick, or handed over something you didn't intend to give. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the unconscious architecture of human behavior, and what he found wasn't a world of rare, calculating villains. It was something far more unsettling, that most manipulation doesn't require malice. It requires psychology. Specifically, it requires knowledge of the gaps in your self-awareness that you don't know exist. These are 3 of them. Pay attention. The first tactic is the most invisible, because it uses your own psychology against you. Jung identified the shadow as the collection of traits, impulses, and characteristics you've rejected, buried, or refused to acknowledge in yourself. Everyone has one. The parts deemed too angry, too needy, too ambitious, too weak, pushed underground because at some point, showing them felt dangerous. Here's what manipulation exploits. You will react with disproportionate intensity to the qualities in others that mirror your own shadow. The manipulator doesn't need to know Jungian theory to use this. They simply learn, through observation or instinct, what triggers you. What accusation makes you immediately defensive? What quality in others produces an outsized reaction? Then they aim at it. It looks like this in practice. Someone accuses you of being selfish, at a moment strategically chosen to destabilize you. Not because the accusation is accurate, because they've noticed that selfishness is something you're privately afraid of being, something your shadow carries, and that the accusation alone will send you scrambling to disprove it. So you give more than you intended. You concede ground you shouldn't have. You apologize for a position that didn't require an apology, all to escape the internal discomfort of a label that struck something deep. Jung called this being hooked by the shadow. The manipulation didn't require force. It required one precisely aimed word, and your own psychology did the rest. The defense isn't to become cold to criticism. It's to do the work Jung prescribed. Integrate the shadow. When you've genuinely examined the parts of yourself you're ashamed of, when you've looked at them honestly and stopped fearing them, the hook has nothing to catch on. A person who knows their own darkness cannot be destabilized by someone else pointing at it. Persona exploitation. The second tactic targets something you've spent years carefully constructing. Your persona. Jung's term for the social mask you present to the world is not a lie. It's a necessary tool. The curated version of yourself you bring to professional settings, social circles, public life. The identity you've built around how you want to be perceived. But it has a vulnerability built into its structure. Because the persona is built for an audience, it can be controlled by an audience. The manipulator who understands this doesn't attack your persona. They flatter it. Specifically, they flatter the gap between who your persona claims to be and who you privately fear you aren't. Watch how this operates. You present yourself as someone generous, fair, above pettiness. The manipulator mirrors that image back to you. You're so reasonable, you always see both sides. I knew you'd understand. And then makes a request that is unreasonable, one-sided, and designed to benefit only them. To refuse now is to contradict the identity they just handed you. Your persona,
your need to be seen as the person they described, does the compliance for them. This is why the most effective manipulation often feels like a compliment. It isn't flattering your ego, it's building a cage out of your ego and locking you inside the version of yourself you most want to be perceived as. Jung's answer was individuation, the process of developing an identity rooted in the self rather than the persona. A person who knows who they actually are, who doesn't need the mirror of social approval to feel real. That person can receive a compliment without being controlled by it. They can hear you're so reasonable and think, let me evaluate whether this request is reasonable on its own merits, not whether agreeing to it confirms the identity I've been offered. That gap between the compliment and the decision is where freedom lives.
Collective shadow pressure. The third tactic doesn't come from an individual. It comes from a group, and it is the most powerful of the three because it weaponizes something Jung identified as one of the deepest human drives, the need to belong. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the collective shadow, the darkness that groups project outward onto individuals or other groups to avoid examining themselves. The designated outsider, the person the room turns against not because they've done something wrong, but because the group needs somewhere to place what it won't face internally. Manipulation through collective pressure looks like this. A social environment, a workplace, a family system, a friend group, generates a consensus about who you are, what you should do, what is acceptable. The consensus is never stated as pressure, it's stated as obvious. Everyone agrees. This is just how things are done. You're the only one who has a problem with this. And the human nervous system, wired at its deepest level to prioritize belonging over accuracy, begins to doubt itself. Not because the evidence changed, because the social cost of maintaining an independent position becomes too high. Jung observed that the group does not think. It reacts from the collective unconscious, from inherited patterns, from the shadow of the crowd. And the individual who cannot distinguish between what I genuinely believe and what the group needs me to believe is endlessly available for manipulation at scale. The defense is the most psychologically demanding of all three, the capacity to hold your own perception under social pressure, not arrogance, not contrarianism, the quiet, grounded ability to sit inside a room full of people who disagree with you and still trust what you know to be true. Jung called it psychological maturity, the point at which a person stops needing the group's verdict to feel certain of their own. Jung never framed these as tactics used by villains. He framed them as the inevitable consequence of unconsciousness, in the manipulator and in the person being manipulated. The shadow that gets hooked, the persona that gets flattered into compliance, the individual that dissolves under collective pressure. These aren't weaknesses unique to certain people. They are the default settings of the unexamined mind. And the only exit, the one Jung returned to across an entire career, is the same in all three cases. Know yourself, not as a project, not as a performance, as a practice, ongoing, honest, sometimes uncomfortable, of seeing clearly what is actually running your behavior before someone else does. Because the person who has done that work doesn't just resist manipulation, they stop being a target.
Drop a comment. I see the tactic now. Subscribe, because the next video goes deeper into the psychology of who is actually making your decisions.